Stalin knew, however, that power in the modern world rested on industrialization. He had inherited a backwards country, and he was determined to industrialize it as fast as possible. So the goal for him was to create a workers' paradise. He was tired of waiting. He wanted the power to defend against all enemies. Stalin, by the time he was in charge, saw the rise of fascism in Western Europe. And he knew that sooner or later, a Western country was going to invade the Soviet Union. And so he wanted to make sure he was prepared. That preparation took the form of 5-year plans. Just as military operations require careful planning, Stalin adopted the ideas of a command economy. Instead of relying on market forces and supply and demand to set prices, Stalin took charge of all economic activity as if the economy were his military. Instead of exporting revolution then in this period, Stalin claimed to focus on socialism in one country. He was going to build up socialism in the Soviet Union that would then provide a basis for exporting communism later. But his primary goal at this moment was to defend the Soviet Union against the rise of fascism in Western Europe. The first 5-year plan lasted from 1928 to 1932. Now, if you're clever, you'll say to yourself, that's only 4 years. And you're right. Stalin was always very good at claiming his victory before the end of the plan. He wanted to make sure that everybody would celebrate his great successes because Stalin was always successful. Stalin never failed. The first 5-year plan rested on Großplan. This was a policy of collectivization. Much of Soviet agriculture was still mired in medieval and early modern techniques of small plots. Stalin saw that in Western Europe, and particularly in the United States, that the most successful agricultural farms were large estates, large farms, consolidated into one. And so Stalin ordered the collectivization of all agriculture in the Soviet Union. The farms would be run as a kolkhoz, a factory farm, so that all the peasants would be treated as factory workers instead of peasants. They would not go out in the field on their own with their own agenda. They would all be taking orders from a Communist Party official. They would march out in the morning. They would march back at the end of the day. To make sure that each of these independent kolkhozs were following the directives of superior, multiple kolkhozs had to share a machine tractor station. This machine tractor station obviously would have a tractor. And so all of the kolkhozs around the region would share the tractor. It would be doled out by the administrator of the machine tractor station. It would also have the seeds necessary for work. It would have any hand tools necessary for work. And so as long as a kolkhoz cooperated with the Communist Party, it would get favorable treatment. But if the peasants on the kolkhoz didn't say nice things about the administrator at the machine tractor station, they would hold back the necessary tools to get the job done. If a kolkhoz did not meet its quotas and its objectives, then Stalin would punish them. What then were the results of this 5-year plan? Well, about 10 million Soviet citizens were either killed or starved out of 148 million. The peasants simply did not want to cooperate and change. And so Stalin either killed them or starved them to death. Another 5 million were sent to labor camps. Once Russian peasants saw what was happening either to themselves or to their neighbors, they began to, quote, cooperate with Soviet officials. And Soviet agriculture faced a rapid transformation from a medieval economy to a modern farm. Now that is easier said than done. There were 1,678 peasant uprisings in the first 10 weeks of 1930. The peasants were not simply going to go along of their own free will. Stalin didn't care. He treated this as a military operation. Either you follow orders or you die. That's it. Peasants also responded by simply killing their livestock. These numbers show the livestock in the millions, and you can see for horses there's a 55% decline, for cattle a 40% decline, for sheep and goats a 66% decline, for hogs a 55% decline. If Soviet officials were going to take their livestock, the peasants were simply going to kill them and eat them. This reduced the breeding stock available for the Soviet Union, and it did incredible damage to rural agriculture. But peasants simply didn't care. They believed they were either going to die, they were going to starve, or go to a concentration camp, and so they were going to live for the moment and not worry about the future. The second and third five-year plans shifted the focus to the urban economy. The goal of the second five-year plan was to build machine tools. Machine tools are tools that build other machines. They build the parts for other machines. And so instead of crafting each individual machine, tractor, car, truck, by hand, that process was then mechanized. Mechanized drills, mechanized lathes, mechanized assembly. The Soviet Union simply did not have the machine tools in place. Machine tools began to develop in the middle of the 19th century in Western Europe. The Tsar had no interest in building factories, and so they did not have the infrastructure in place to build factories, to build cars, to build trucks, to build anything. And so Joseph Stalin made this his first priority, build the machine tools to then have a foundation for more machines. In other words, he put in place the infrastructure, beginning to have oil refineries, lay down railroads, all the factories link them together, so that in the entire Soviet economy, under his eyes, would work like a well-oiled machine. And anyone who deviated from his planning was simply shot. The third five-year plan was supposed to focus on consumer goods. Shoes, pants, shirts, all of the things that make life comfortable. Because in the West, by the 1930s, there were consumer goods. Things like Coca-Cola, green beans in a can. Right? The Soviet Union had none of this. And so Soviet workers were still experiencing a consumer goods shortage. And so Stalin wanted factories then to turn to those types of products to make life a little bit less miserable for the people who listened to him. He wasn't concerned about the people who didn't. But this was cut short, right? You can look at the top again. This is 1938 to 1939. Well, you say to yourself, well, was Stalin that successful? Was he that bold to say, well, in 1 year we're done? No. Right? What's happening in 1939? In 1939, Western Europe is under the sway of fascism. Adolf Hitler had successfully transformed his republic into a totalitarian regime. By 1938, you have the Anschluss. By 1938, there was the Sudeten crisis, and Stalin realized that he was going to be alone on the European continent with fascists. And so he ordered his factories then to turn to producing weapons and machines of war. This chart illustrates the changes in Soviet resources from 1928 to 1950. And so this is electricity production in terms of megawatts, millions of megawatts from 5 to 91. In steel production, in This is for metric tons, millions of metric tons, 4.3 to 18. Oil barrels, millions of barrels, 11, 31. Coal production, metric tons, 33 to 166. Machine tools, right? These are in the thousands of machine tools, from 2,000 machine tools to 58,000 machine tools. The number of tractors in the thousands, right? So in each of these categories, there were dramatic rises in the material capability of the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, rapidly industrializing. The cost in human lives, though, were dramatic. This chart looks at the output of weapons, what was happening in 1933, and then the expected output in 1938. Guns in the thousands, shells in the millions, right? You can look down the chart from moving from 11,000 guns to 38,000 guns, shells 45 to 100 million, rifles, machine guns. In each of these categories, Stalin placed an emphasis on building the tools necessary for defending the Soviet Union against a coming Nazi invasion. Why did he think there was a coming Nazi invasion? Because, as we're going to see in the next lecture, Hitler saw the peoples of Eastern Europe as Untermenschen, subhumans, and he was looking for living space. Stalin wanted to defend the Soviet Union of an impending German attack. He did not believe the French, the British, or the Americans would help him survive that attack. Why Stalin then? How did a man like Stalin, who was coarse, crude, cruel, a psychopath, a sociopath, how did he come to control and dominate the Soviet Union? Well, the history goes back deep. The Russian czars were not able to defend their empire. They lost wars. They lost the Napoleonic Wars. They lost the Crimean War. They lost World War I. In each of these wars, they were humiliated, and their only success was with their allies. So Stalin looked at that, saw where the Soviet Union sat in 1928 when he rose to power, and vowed that he would not be in the same position. He was able to convince his fellow communists that their only hope for survival was a ruthless and brutal campaign to eliminate all dissent and to transform the Soviet Union. The goal then was rapid industrialization. That the only way to have the political might to defend against the fascists was through rapid industrialization. This benefited Stalin because it put power in his hands. He used that industrialized might not only against his foreign enemies, but he used it against his domestic enemies as well. He was a totalitarian dictator. He emphasized militarism, his own status as a mystical ruler, and he tolerated absolutely no dissent, either in the press, in the military, or anywhere else in society. He either convinced people to follow him, those that weren't convinced were sent to a gulag or shot. As many as 20 million people died in this transition from an authoritarian to a totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union.